welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. My name is Catherine Seabrook, and I'm a commercial agriculture educator with University of Illinois Extension, serving Daviess-Stephenson-Winnebago counties. Talking Crop is a row crop production podcast with episodes occurring every other week during the growing season between the months of May and September. In each episode, I bring on a guest speaker to discuss topics related to their areas of expertise. In today's episode, I talk with Dr. Marty Williams, who is an affiliate professor with the University of Illinois Department of Crop Sciences. Marty and I discuss his recent research on how weather conditions before, during, and after herbicide application can affect herbicide efficacy. We touched on what effect this has on herbicide resistance and how integrated weed management can help offset some of these effects. In the episode description, I've linked Marty's website, which provides information about his lab, as well as a list of his publications. And I've also provided links to the articles that we discussed in the episode. And you'll also find a link to the herbicide resistance database that is mentioned, along with my contact information and a link to the podcast survey. On the next episode of Talking Crop, I'll be speaking with Reagan Tibbs, a fellow commercial ag educator with Illinois Extension. That episode will be a little bit different from normal, as we will be discussing some ag policy topics. And that episode will air on Wednesday, July 23rd. So now, without further ado, please enjoy this episode of Talking Crop, How Variable Weather Leads to Varied Herbicide Efficacy with Dr. Marty Williams. Marty, welcome to the Talking Crop podcast. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today.
Well, thanks, Catherine. I appreciate the invitation and excited to talk about some of our research.
Yeah, so just starting with that right away, in the past 5 or so years, your lab has published a few different journal articles on relatively the same topic, and that's essentially herbicide efficacy in varied or variable weather. And just the number of these articles made me curious. What brought this on? What was kind of the impetus for this research getting started?
Sure, yeah. A couple of things got us interested in working on this, and this, I should mention my colleagues, Dr. Aaron Hager, the extension weed specialist with the University of Illinois. He and I were visiting some years back about the amount of data generated by the herbicide evaluation program. And this is a program that he leads up at Illinois that conducts about 100 trials each year on different herbicides, herbicide treatments, weed management tactics. And he had been archiving that data. And it was something that we decided, there's probably value. Well, these individual trials serve a very specific purpose. Collectively, perhaps we can gain knowledge if we compile across trials and framed questions that might be relevant to the industry, to growers. And so that's what we did. And one of the questions we had, we thought this is great, because one of the questions we had was, how does weather affect herbicide performance? We know weather does, there's many things that affect herbicide performance, the weed species, perhaps their weed density, if soil active products, soil texture, soil physical properties, a whole host of things, including herbicide rate. But we really want to focus on weather because we've seen a pattern of more frequent weather extremes in recent decades. And there's indication that this will continue into the future, where we have less than ideal conditions for crop production. So that was where it came from. Literally, we had a bunch of data we wanted to do something useful with, and this was a great approach where instead of most of the looks at weather on herbicides has been, say, 2 or 3 environments, maybe 10 environments at most, to look at herbicide performance. Here's something where we could compile literally hundreds or thousands of trials to have up to thousands of environments to begin to look at, tease apart just how does rainfall before or after herbicide application affect herbicide performance. Those types of questions where you simply we couldn't do it if we were to start from scratch. But by mining these historical databases, we're able to frame types of questions that are very relevant to the issues facing growers today.
And you mentioned how there are a host of ways that the weather and the environment can affect herbicide efficacy. And I think the biggest one, especially if we start talking about post-emergence herbicides specifically, the biggest one is, of course, there's rain fast periods. You want to make sure that you're not
Right.
going to just wipe off the herbicide straight from off the plant as soon as it's sprayed on, right? But
Hmm.
there are other effects that I think they don't come top of mind. So can you talk about some of those? Obviously, you guys, did the research to determine, do these effects actually happen? Like statistically, are they significant? But what in general are those other effects besides obviously rainfall after herbicide application, at least for post-emergence herbicides?
Sure, sure. So if you think about rainfall, temperature being uh, likely drivers of some of the things, and things that influence weed growth, and obviously it influences crop growth as well. But when we were looking at herbicide efficacy, how well do we control those weeds? So you think about things that influence weed growth, and something with rainfall would influence just how much. Water might be in the soil profile for the plants to take up, and are these weeds under some type of drought stress condition? Because usually under drier conditions you can have a thicker cuticle layer on the leaves, which can reduce the amount of herbicide uptake through the leaf surface. Hotter conditions can actually increase with adequate water can increase metabolism of certain herbicides. It can also increase weed growth where you might miss that window of opportunity to get the ideal weed growth stage to control the species. Um, and it's clearly it's not the same. Weather won't necessarily have the same effect on all weed species, and there are certain species that are more adapted to drier, hotter conditions that might be more of a problem one year than another year. Um, but it's with a varying by species as well. There's kind of a whole host of potential physiological mechanisms that how 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 weather influences weed growth and might impact how it interacts with a herbicide that's applied to it. Um, but there's a few out there that are pretty well known. And the benefit of this work is we're actually able to quantify, more precisely how some rainfall pattern influence or air temperature pattern influences that product's performance on specific weed species.
And so, can you talk a little bit about what your research found? Like I said in the beginning, I know there were a few different papers. I'm thinking specifically right now about the most recent one on post-emergence herbicide efficacy. So, what did you guys end up finding in your research after you compiled and analyzed all that data?
Well, let me tell you a little bit to back up just a moment here and
Sure.
walk through the approach. Um, and that is compiling lots of trials over time and space. I think for all the post-emergence work, we actually worked with a data set that we had compiled with extension weed scientists from across the U.S. So not just the University of Illinois data set, but also herbicide evaluation programs at other land-grant universities, from Texas to Ontario, Canada, from North Dakota to Virginia, about 20 institutions total, over 11,000 trials collectively, and which represents um, over 10 million observations of weeds in, you know, and observations of weeds in experiments, right? So these are replicated experiments, so very powerful data set. And then um, whittled that down to look at just in this case, we tried to pick some of the herbicides and weeds that were most well represented. And so we're looking particularly at water hemp, the morning glory species, and giant foxtail. Those were three species that were really represented well in this massive data set. And then some of the most common post-emergence herbicides, including fomesafen, glyphosate, mesotrione, and and then a combination of fomesafen plus glyphosate. I had add another paper in there. We also looked at glufosinate and um, used an analytical approach with these data to identify what are some of the major types of weather factors that influence performance. So rather than us saying, "Oh, we know it's rainfall," we're going to say how to rainfall. No, we collected the environmental data for all of these thousands of trials. Whether it was rainfall or temperature, different time periods before application, during application, post application, amount of solar radiation, um, relative humidity, a whole host of different weather factors that help describe what happened in each trial. And then from that, this analysis enables us to identify those weather factors that were most influential on how well the herbicide worked on each species. And it varies by herbicide. Okay, so for most of the post herbicides we looked at, temperature average temperature about 10 days before herbicide application and about 10 days after application were some of the biggest drivers. Both temperature and precipitation were some of the big drivers. When we talk about glufosinate, then we also see how solar radiation the day of application can be important. And what we found in general was that there's limits, I should say. So we have these weather factors that are very important in how the herbicide performs. And as such, there are sort of limits or these thresholds where herbicide efficacy can deteriorate and we lose the ability to successfully control that species. And it often happened when we got to these more extreme types of events, they're extremely low rainfall or particularly high rainfall events. Same thing with temperature. If we had just in general, when the average temperature was in the low 60s and cooler, or in the upper 70s and warmer, many of these herbicide by weed species combinations, the weeds just were more likely to survive these applications. So the more extreme types of rain, those outlier kinds of events, it was really hard to have good control of the species. And under most, it is a general topic. There was very specific species herbicide combinations. They all didn't fit the same pattern. So, and what I could say about if we looked across all the species and all the types of herbicide treatments we looked at, it doesn't matter what the weather is. Somebody will succeed. Somebody will break through the
Right.
These individual herbicide treatments. If I can just add to that, the one thing we did see was that if we used combinations of post-emergence herbicides, that reduced the risk of that incomplete control. Didn't eliminate the risk, but in general, at least of the combinations of herbicides we looked at, there was more likely to be able to avoid a catastrophic failure
Mm-hmm.
in product performance.
Yeah, I think that you talked about the methodology of putting this research together, and in reading these papers, I thought it was really interesting and a great idea to take all of that data. And it's interesting too because it's years and years of data too, right? So it's just like you
Right.
said, a really robust data set to tell a really fascinating story across time, to give us some really interesting insights.
Mm-hmm.
And I know this is not really the scope of what we're talking about, but there's a paper that you did a while back as well on glyphosate efficacy that you utilized the
Right.
same data collection process for, which again told a really interesting story. So
Mm-hmm.
it's very interesting research. And when I was reading about it, I actually thought the opposite when it came to higher temperatures. I kind of assumed that the herbicide would be more it would work better because the higher temperatures would make the herbicide, those molecules work a little faster and all of that. But it was interesting to learn that, no, it's actually the plant that works harder to potentially overcome that herbicide application. So I was thinking, you guys kind of can only really speculate about why these effects are happening with the weather and the herbicide efficacy. Do you know
Hmm.
if there's any research being done to look at those effects specifically to determine, is it because the plant is increasing its metabolism in those higher
Oh,
temperatures, things of that
right.
nature?
Yeah, good question, Catherine. Because when it comes down to it, yeah, this work that the analytical approach we use, the type of data we have, we are really what we're seeing are associations. We're not seeing the underlying mechanism by which each response occurs, and we're unable to as well, because right, these are studies that have already happened. The data
Hmm.
are what they are. We can't go back and collect more data in any of these trials. But the strength lies in the number of observations to see patterns that, yeah, merit, follow-up research, some of this mechanistic follow-up to research to see, okay, how are, weeds um, surviving when we get to these more extreme types of weather events. And getting back to your question, is anyone following up with that? And it's a wide open area of research. The challenge with picking a single variable, weather variable, and studying it intensely is that you can look at a specific variable, but often it's multiple factors coming together that
Right.
influence how the plant responds. So I think there's some great research to be done there. Probably the best research is if we could have, combinations of weather factors to test. It quickly becomes expensive
Right.
and just a challenge as well. I think there's that's an area of research that's worth doing. Probably an equally important area of research that might yield not only valuable science to the scientific community, but also valuable information to the crop production and protection industry, is how how are we going to use this information to do things differently. And I feel like one common theme we see from our research is the challenge of relying on limited number of weed control tactics, whether it's how they perform in whatever weather might occur after planting. uh, but also, and you alluded to the work we did previously, glyphosate efficacy over time, is that weeds are adapting. They're adapting to our management, and that was really what we showed quite clearly with our research on glyphosate, that we're not really going to get into much today, but is how weed communities are adapting, even at and not necessarily becoming like obvious, like, oh wow, now we have glyphosate resistance, as how the scientific community measures glyphosate resistance. There's adaptations going on that we can't even detect in our standard protocols. So um, my hope is that this research, it'd be great if it led to some looking at sort of the mechanistic of how how weeds are responding. I think also research on new tools to overcome, new tools, new weed management systems to overcome the variable weather that we're dealing with in the Midwest, and also the adaptations, these slow, well, I shouldn't say slow, on geological time scale, these rapid adaptations um, to our management practices. Those two things that are really a major, I think, outcome of this research, or should be incentives to what are we going to, how are we going to overcome these challenges with weeds? Because I personally, I think weeds are with us for the long run. I'm optimistic that we have new tools coming out, and it would be great if any of these new tools we use them in a way that we prolong the longevity as well, where the weeds don't just rapidly within 20 years adapt and now that tool is no longer available, as is the case we've seen in large part with glyphosate alone.
Yeah, and you touched on a couple things that I was actually going to get to, which is great. So the first being, um, with these results, we're learning some things about, how obviously the weather affects herbicide efficacy. And of course, it's very nuanced, right? Because there's different weed species, there's different herbicides
Hmm.
that you
Right.
use, and you did find some kind of, I would say maybe some generalizations. And so with those, do you have any like recommendations to producers then in terms of, maybe looking at the weather? But that's the thing too. There's a big caveat there is obviously we understandably cannot control the weather. And farmers are always under a time crunch when it comes to getting spraying done. So they can try to take not obviously just rainfall into account, but temperatures before and after they're spraying. But that gets very complicated very quickly, of
Right.
course. So, with all of that said, do you still have any kind of recommendations to producers in terms of taking this information and utilizing it in their operations?
Yes, and I think the kind of one of the key things is the more hurdles we can throw at the weed community, the better. Way, we're including some type of pre-emergence applications. Certainly from the work that we did with post-emergence herbicide applications. If you're relying on just post-emergence products alone, it's a risky business. Um, so having more tools included in there, such as a good pre-emergence plan, um, and not relying on that alone either, because
Mm-hmm.
we've done the work with the pre-emergence herbicides, and it's the same kind of story. There are species that there are conditions that those products will not shine in, for certain species, and particularly when we look at something season long. So the more complicated we can make it for the weed community, the better. And I know there's limits on what technology is available, and what can a grower afford, and there's a whole host of things that growers are dealing with, all sorts of
Mm-hmm.
decisions and challenges they're faced with. Um, and there's going to be times where weeds are not the only thing they're working on, right? There's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of other considerations. So I think kind of temper my comments with reality here, but there's a critical need for having a diverse amount of tactics as possible to uh, reduce the chances um, for breakthroughs of species that are going to be problematic, for years to come. So the greater the diversity, um, I think growers should be thinking about. And I don't think it's all on the growers either. I think as a there's a need for more tools, certainly chemistry, but also non-chemical approaches as well. And I think there is some innovation uh, being done there with detection and robotics, that and physical weed control approaches. It's some of that innovation is making its way into the market, in more specialty crop production, and showing some success. In part, probably because they're in areas where you can control the amount of water, and out in California or other Western states where you can control the water through irrigation. That's huge, and
Mm-hmm.
that's not necessarily an option for everybody in the Midwest. But anyway, I think there's some new technologies coming out. Harvest weed seed control, another example. Again, we don't rely too heavily on that alone. Otherwise, we'll be selecting for species that set seed or shed seed before harvest. um, but you know, aiming for a combination, a system that has as many opportunities to kill weeds or reduce seed production, the better.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that's the story that we always tell when it comes to herbicide resistance management. You want to throw as as many tools at them as possible to make sure we were overcoming any potential, whether it be direct resistance or like you're talking about with that glyphosate paper, just adaptations that they're throwing back at us. We want to be able to counter that with multiple methods of control, which is really important and something we harp on a lot. And it made me curious reading your papers about what these effects will have on herbicide resistance. Over time, the weather, it's currently variable. It will likely become even more variable. We're due to have increased air temperatures over time that, as we know with this research now, can enhance or reduce herbicide efficacy depending on a lot of different factors. And with that, I just wondered what your take on was, what that overall effect will have on herbicide resistance as a whole.
Oh, sure. Yeah, and I think our how we test herbicide resistance, how we confirm herbicide resistance is great. I mean, it's important. Um, I think um, it captures uh, the real obvious changes in weed populations that um, may be very obvious to detect. Like suddenly, my water hemp is no longer controlled by Callisto type of thing, and that's helpful. I think it's and obviously, you know, there's plenty of underreporting. There's those listeners who are aware of the website, Ian Heap's website on herbicide resistance globally. There's documentation there of species, populations, herbicides that have locations where there's resistance that has been confirmed. That just scratches the surface, in my
Right.
opinion. It's important, it's great, but it does not completely account for all
No.
the resistance out there. And as I mentioned earlier, with our work with glyphosate, we saw in that work a number of different, 7 different major agronomic weeds, many locations, this deteriorating uh, control with glyphosate. Over a 25-year period, we saw it time and again. Poor control, more variable control over time. And Catherine, for every single population at every location, none of those were deemed glyphosate resistant. None of them, met that criteria or had been flagged as, screened for glyphosate resistance. Yet, time and again, across the board, we saw this loss of control. So these adaptations that might be a combination of small effects coming together with the location, perhaps with the weather, perhaps with the population there, and and non-target site types of mechanisms within the plant, where collectively that product just doesn't work. Glyphosate alone just didn't work very well, even though it didn't meet the criteria of glyphosate resistance. So I think that's a real challenge with some of these metabolic based resistance mechanisms, is that they can be these small effects coming together, and when you throw in a few other aspects of the crop production, we didn't have the rainfall we needed, to have the weeds growing well before application, or whatever the combinations come together. And I think that lends itself to opportunities of greater herbicide resistance. And um, whether we whether we formally notice it and catalog it or not is another issue. But on the ground, it's the same. It has huge implications to the grower. Is that this deteriorating, this loss of utility of some of the herbicides that we've relied on heavily for weed control. And yeah, that's so I hate to paint it as a gloom and doom here, but it's there's again, I get back to, it underscores the need for having as diverse tactics as possible. And the bottom line, I think, that is, while 30 years 30 years ago. Has it been that long? It has been that long. It was introduction of Roundup Ready beans and then corn and cotton and other crops. Um, that period of kind of simple weed management control, even simple approaches that look good initially,
Hmm.
those days are gone. The
Right.
simplistic approach, we simply have to have more management involved and more decisions in being successful in our weed control programs you know than we did a few decades ago.
Yes. Yeah, man, there's a lot to kind of unpack with all of that. I think it's fascinating how there's so much nuance, especially so with that glyphosate paper. I'm glad you finally talked about it. We keep mentioning it, so I'm
Yeah,
glad you
let's
highlighted it
just
a little
drag it
bit.
out.
Yes. A couple of years ago, I was doing this presentation on herbicide resistance, and I utilized that paper to talk about how it's not always explicit cases of true reported herbicide resistance that are
Right.
causing these these escapes and these issues, but it's also those more indirect effects, I think is how I worded it, especially based on what you talked about in that glyphosate paper. It's indirect effects of these adaptations that weeds are undergoing that the effect then looks like resistance, but it's not true resistance in a way. And you kind of
Mm-hmm.
talked about how it does sound like doom and gloom, but at the end of the day, the best thing that we can do, or that producers can do, really is utilize an integrated weed management approach whereby they utilize more practices than just relying on herbicides.
Mm-hmm.
And I also wanted to add that when I was thinking about the effects of weather on herbicide efficacy and how that can affect resistance, I kind of wondered if maybe, sometimes if you have those low levels of resistance and then you have, maybe a weed escape, not because of resistance and not because of a weed adaptation, but now because of weather, how that can potentially then lead to, quote unquote, escapes. And if they have low levels of resistance because they're not being controlled very well due to those weather conditions, then you might end up with a resistance issue as a result. And again, it wasn't directly because the weed was exhibiting true resistance, but it was because of that lack of proper control due to
Right.
weather.
Yeah, that enables, this is whether, these other factors that enable those alleles, those s- maybe small effect resistance type alleles to survive and be there for the next generation.
Yeah.
And just the chance of, building over time is
Hmm.
combinations of, where you have weather enabling, you know, extreme weather or, less than ideal weather
Right.
enabling herbicide resistance to um, to develop over time.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I know, like you said, we're kind of talking doom and gloom here, but the bright side of it is that at the end of the day, an integrated weed management approach is the best thing to do going forward, because if the herbicide efficacy is being lowered due to resistance or a weed adaptation or the weather, you want to
Hmm.
have something else in your back pocket to utilize that's going to control them, barring all those other factors.
Right.
Um,
Hmm.
so with all of this, I wondered then, is there potentially going to be an impact on, corn and soybean yields due to this potential loss of herbicide efficacy with these varying weather conditions?
Oh, excellent question, Catherine. And so we've done some research on this.
Oh, perfect.
um, Actually, using this large database, some of those trials had crop yield taken as well, and different herbicide treatments where you have, we saw a range of different levels of weed control: early season, mid season, late season. So again, we um, well, and we're in the process of continually adding to the base database and running more analyses. But if we look at um, some of the main drivers of yield loss in corn and soybean from these trials that are conducted over, we have thousands of trials. We find that when you have this less than ideal level of weed control, you know, it's not complete weed control. It's just a little better. Say on a scale of 0 to 100, something like less than 95% control um, early season, and then couple that with um, say challenging weather for the crop, particularly around flowering, whether it's corn silking, soybean flowering. Um, those challenging weather events exacerbate the um, well, I should say, let me describe that differently. The uh, low level, the incomplete weed control exacerbates the effect of these challenging weather events on the crop. So we have um, some pretty significant yield losses. If you have like 5% of the community out there that escapes, and then you have either hot or dry conditions at the time the crop plant is very sensitive to stresses, which is often around flowering, we can have much greater yield losses than if we'd had perfect weed control. So, and we've seen that both in corn and soybean, uh, where it's obviously it's hard to have a completely weed-free field. It takes a lot of work to achieve
Yes.
that.
Hmm.
But what we found is that if you have incomplete control, and it doesn't have to, be a disaster to still have a pretty, those escapes can have a pretty significant impact on the crop, particularly when the crop already has conditions that might stress it. And it makes sense, if you've got limited water supply and you have a few weeds out there using up soil water that the crop needs at flowering, it makes biologically it makes sense, but it is a little bit sobering. If we think about, we're heading in a period where we're more likely to have warmer conditions, uh, mid-season, late season, and also we're likely to have drier conditions mid-season, late season in crop production. You know, warmer, drier. Those are the types of conditions where having just a few weeds really wreaks havoc on crop yield. So we can't. We're not. We're not in the business of like, well, what's weed control going to be in 2040 or 2050? Obviously that's a that's a big task. But if we just think about look at some of the types of weather we're expected to have in the coming decades, um, it also argues, and based on the work we've done, these relationships with this more extreme weather on crop yield, and if our weed management is not getting better, there's a challenge there. And I think it also speaks to the need for continuing continuing to invest in weed science research to come up with new tools, whether it's public sector, private sector, the need for new tools and fitting them in weed management systems that are more resilient to extreme weather, I think is important. I think that's what that body of research on crop yield says, is that, and if we look at what we're getting in the future, what likely to have in the future, now we couldn't have a stronger need for more weed management tools being developed right now than ever.
Hmm. Yes, 100%. We already talked a lot about the need for integrated weed management and to have more tools developed to put into our toolbox. The famous saying, I think that the better off we're all going to be. So that's definitely something to look forward to. But Marty, thank you so much for joining me again. I had a really great time speaking with you about this. As we talked in the beginning, my background is weed science, so I was especially excited to chat with you about this really interesting research. So again, thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, well, thanks for the opportunity, Catherine. It's been a pleasure.